Hey there! I'm Chroma, and welcome to part 16 of Making an Abstract Adventure. Welcome back! This time, we've made doors, another thing that we can interact with that can transport us to different parts of a level. So, showing off what I mean by that, we have this door here that's been made just through a bunch of shapes that I'll show in a second. If we hit our interact button, which is the O key, then we fade to black, get transported somewhere else, and then fade back into wherever we are now. So at the moment we're just in this little black space that I've made. That could be like the inside of a house or something like that. And then we have the same sort of door object here, and then if we hit O again, then we... if I can hit the right buttons, then, yeah, we get transported back through a black screen fade. So, we have that now. Now, breaking the illusion a bit, how that's being done is, way off to the side here, we have the other part of the scene, and we're basically just being kind of teleported between the two things. Which is, yeah, good for not having to, as opposed to transporting between scenes, because then we'd have to load more stuff, and it could be a waste on resources. By having all this in the same scene, it can save on... on resources and all that sort of stuff. Less load times, all that fun stuff. So, let's go into how this is being made. Well, actually, first thing, you may notice that our level looks a lot different than before. That is because our old prototype that we had here, I've, not got rid of it. As you can see, it's kind of archived as old prototype, but I've sort of made a new one. Just to sort of keep things simple a bit with actually making new things, as opposed to trying to just cram them in this big scene, which is becoming more and more difficult as there kind of was running out of room to place new things. Just keeping things simple for now. Just, I'm going to have this empty scene that I'm just going to make and delete things as we make new things, like these doors, for instance. So, and then I kind of have, like, the ground and trees and this sort of, like, gradient here just for art purposes, even though I don't know if this is what the final art is going to look like. And then we still have our like black bottomless pit fade at the bottom. So now onto these doors and how they are being made. So the door object itself is simple enough. It's basically just a bunch of sprites here. So first of all, there was a tint that I added at the end because I thought it looked better being sort of tinted instead of being completely black. Then just a whole bunch of shapes put together, like this background, these like triangle, or I know shapes, these diamonds, then this like door object, and then also messing with the sorting layers to make sure the proper things are on top of what. Then this window and the bars, then this sort of like doorknob here. This is a very generic looking door. I don't imagine actual doors in the game looking like this. I'd probably try to do stuff that's more fancy and stylized. I just tried to make what I could out of just simple shapes. Like I might have a metallic, like futuristic door, or something like a rounded door for like something that the sphere character would go through, or something like that. But this works for now for the purposes of just coding a door that moves us between points. So then we have as a child object of this parent door object, we have the sprites that we just looked at, and then we have this empty object called move to point. Now these two doors aren't actually connected. They're two duplicates of the same prefab that interacting with the first door moves us to here, interacting with the second door moves us back. That is just so we don't necessarily have to have two interconnected doors. We could have basically one-way doors if we wanted to. Interacting with the door at one area. It doesn't have to also be a door. I'm using door as like an umbrella term. There could be like anything that we interact with that moves us to a different part of the level. I don't have any examples of what that might be off the top of my head, but yeah, anything that would cause like a fade to black scene transition sort of thing. It just moves us to another part of the level simply enough. So then on the actual door object itself, again, it's on the interact layer because that's the layer that we have everything that we can interact with on, just for simplicity with coding and the on collision, or like on the on trigger event stuff. Then we have a new tag called fade move, because that's just what I called it, because that's essentially what's happening. It's a It's a move that happens with a fade. Yeah, so then we have 4 delays here to start off with for the fade in delay, move delay, fade out delay, and delay. These are basically just to be able to customize different parts of how we do that fade. So first of all, like, we'll be disabling the player and then waiting like 0.1 seconds, then fading to black, as we'll look at how that's being done in a second, then waiting 0.5 seconds, then actually moving the player and the camera, and then waiting another like 0.5 seconds, and then fading back out from black to being able to see again, and then waiting another 0.1 seconds, and then letting the player gain control again. So yeah, those are just basically what those are for. Just to allow more customization with different types of doors or different types of however we're moving around. Yeah, so then we also have a reference to the move to point that we have down here as a child object. Cool. So now how the actual fade is being done is over on the canvas. There's now a new canvas thing that we now have, which is this giant black square rectangle called screen fade or black fade. And then we're basically just messing with the transparency on this to fade to black or fade out of black. I'm also just realizing as well, so this is going over the health and all that. Not sure if I want the health to be over top or have this covering them. That's something we can decide more when we get to actual level stuff of what looks right. I don't think it'll matter that much. In fact, for this, I think we will just keep it like this for now, where it does cover the health and the collectibles, because again, it won't really make that much of a difference, I don't think. Yeah, anyway, so then we have a script here called black fade that has a public boolean called fade black that will be set to like true or false depending on whether we're fading in or fading out. Yeah, and then this is set by other scripts and it's set to public so that they can access it, and then we can also set a default value of true or false for whatever reason. Eventually, I think when we do more stuff with like properly starting a level, we'll have it start with a black screen like being on, and then us fading into like it fading out into being able to see the level. So eventually this will be set to true, I think. And then a smoothing value for like how fast it like fades in / fades out. So yeah. So now going into all the code of how all this stuff is being done. So first, another thing to talk about as well is I've made another script called player main that is now on both of our players. If I can find them over here. Yep, so now we have another script. In addition to our circle main and square main, we now have a player main on both of them. This is just to sort of simplify things in some of our other areas of code where there was seeming like there's going to be quite a lot of situations where we'd want to get a reference to the player and then disable their ability to move. And before we were doing that by just getting a reference to either the circle main or the square main, seeing which one actually exists depending on which player we're getting a reference to, and then disabling one or the other. I basically made this script to simplify that by just getting a having this one player main script that has references to both of them and does the work of which one is active and which one isn't here, so that other scripts that aren't on the player can just get a reference to the player main script, disable that, and then it disables the player in the same way that we wanted to before, without having to have all this circle main or square main stuff that on every single object or every single script that's going to be getting a reference to the player. Yeah, anyway, so this gets a reference to a private reference to circle main and square main, which one of them is going to be null depending on which player object this is actually on. So then it's going to try and get a reference to both of those. And then it's only going to be able to get one because only one will exist on the player that it's on. And then when this script is enabled, it's going to see if it has a reference to circle main or a reference to square main, depending on which one it has a reference to. It's going to set that script to true. And then on disable, it's going to do the same thing, except it's going to set this to false. So yeah, basically, yeah, it's going to cause the same effect as if we just got a reference to the circle main or the square main and set those to true or false. Yeah, and then how this is being used in scripts, covering the rest of this in a second, is basically by, after getting a reference to the player main script, just setting .enable to true or .enable to false. And it'll do the same thing as setting the circle main or square main to true or false. Yeah, and then an example of then how that's being used in a better way, I guess, is now over on our camera focus script. I've now replaced before it getting reference to the square main, the circle main, seeing which one it was active, and then disabling or enabling both of them. Now it gets reference to the player main scripts, although this is a case where it's disabling both of them. So I'm getting references to the player main as an array, so it can get reference to either one or both of them, and then enable or disable both. Yeah, so in Awake, we're getting a reference to one or both of the player main scripts by using find objects of type player main, with that being plural, because that'll get a reference to all objects that have the player main script on them, which in this case is either, or which is both of our characters, if they both exist in a level. Because again, a reminder that not all levels will have both characters. Some levels you'll be just playing as the one character or the other. Yeah, so there's that. And then down here, in order to disable or enable both of them, we are first getting a reference to the first element of this array, which we know that there's going to be we know that's going to exist because there should always be one player in the scene if this camera and camera focus script is in it. If there isn't, there's bigger problems. So we get a reference to the first element of that array and then setting its .enabled to false. And then we are testing if the player main, this thing that we've gotten here, if its length is 2, so meaning we've got references to both players because both players exist, then we are then getting reference to the other player's player main script and setting its .enabled to false. And then down here doing the exact opposite of, or the same thing, but setting it to true through the same way. Yeah, anyways, the rest of this is all the same, and yeah. So then onto the actual fade move, yeah, stuff here. Actually, no, I'm going to cover the black fade first because of the way that the fade move uses it. So we have these booleans that we just looked at in the inspector, the fade black and the smoothing. Then we have a hidden in inspector, a public bool called fading, which this is just going to be used for kind of simplicity of, or being efficient of sort of testing whether or not we actually should be fading to black or not, because if we are fading to black and the screen's already black, we don't need to continue to do those calculations. So it's sort of saving on resources there, being more optimized, I guess. Yeah, and then getting a reference to the black screen that we are then changing the transparency of. And in order to get a reference to the image component, because that's a UI thing, we have to have at the top using Unity Engine.ui. So yeah, there's that. Then in start, we are setting fading to true by default. And so that whatever thing that we set here, whether it's going to be fading to black or not, will happen. If we wanted to start the game by having it fade to black for some reason, then that would be the case. Or if we started the screen with the screen being black and us wanting to fade out of black into being able to see the level, then that would work properly. So then we are getting a reference to our image component there. Now in update, how we're then changing the color is, first we're testing if we're fading at all, like if we should be fading one way or the other. If we're not, then we're not going to do anything because we don't need to. Then assuming we are fading, then if we are fading to black, then, oh yeah, this fade black. So if it's true, we're going to be fading to black. If it's false, we're going to be fading out of black to being transparent. So yeah, then we're setting the color. We're getting the reference to the color of the image and then setting that color to using a function called color.lerp, which is very similar to the vector3.lerp and mathf.lerp that we looked at before. Again, that's linear interpolation for the actual term. So we're setting it to lerp from the color that currently is to a new color that is all black, and then the transparency being 1, so it being completely not transparent, so it'll be a black screen. Yeah, and then doing that by smoothing time.delta time. Again, that functions the same way as how we've seen it before. So then to test for the fading stuff for optimization, we're then testing if the color has reached being all black but all transparent. So we're at the color that we're linear interpolating to. Then we're setting fading to false because we don't need to keep running this function every frame if it's not going to do anything because it's already the fully non-transparent black. Then, otherwise, if fade to black is false, so we are fading to being transparent, then the black screen color is going to lerp between its current color and a new color that is still all black, but is now completely transparent. This fourth value is like the alpha. Actually, yeah, over here on our black fade. Yeah, these 4 values are what correspond to the 4 values that we saw in our code there. So except here it goes between 0 and 255. In our code it's going between 0 and 1. There's actually a button here you can switch it between whether it's going between 0 and 255 or 0 and 1.0. Yeah, in code, the way that we're using this function, it's going between 0 and 1. So this is what the corresponding values would be if you were to put these values in. Yeah, so let me undo that. So yes, that's what we want. So then all zeros and a 1 at the end is transparent black, or a non-transparent black, so a black screen like we're looking at right now. Let me also just set that to be false. Yeah, so then yeah, and then all zeros is a completely transparent black. The actual color of the black doesn't really matter if it's transparent, with just being consistent, I guess. So yeah, so that's how that's being done. Then onto the fade move script on our doors. So then we have the 5 public variables that we looked at in the inspector with all these delays, and then a private reference to the black fade and the main camera to be able to move the camera when we move the player as well. Yeah, so in our start function here, we get a reference to the black fade script, which we're also using find object of type because there's only going to be one black screen. There should be at least. Again, if there's not, then there's a bigger problem. Yeah, and then getting reference to the camera by using find object of type camera follow, and then getting the transform component because all we care about is the transform because all we're using it for is just moving the position. Then having a public void move player that we'll look at in a second on the player interact. This is going to be called by, actually, okay, we just look at it quickly because yeah, it'll be easier to explain. So on our private void on trigger stay function that we had before when we were using this interact test, now we're having a another condition of if we collided or are in the trigger of something called fade move, then we are getting a component on the thing that we collided with called fade move. We're getting a reference to that script on the door that we just interacted with, and then calling the function that we just saw called move player. And then as a input parameter, we're putting in getting the component player main. So the player main of the player that interacted with the door, so we know which one to disable and then move. Yeah, and while it's usually not a good idea to use get component like in the middle of code, like if it's possible, it's better to use it in like awake or start and all that. This is a case where we don't know what door we've interacted with until now that we've interacted with it, we're getting the component fade move on it. It's something that we can't necessarily do earlier unless we, I guess, got references to like all the fade moves, but that would just seem a bit redundant. And like this is fine because it's also something that only happens once. I suppose with the get component player main, because it's the player main on this game object, we could make that a variable. But because of how rarely this will happen, I'm not going to bother doing this just yet. If we have more interact conditions where we are getting reference to the player main to do stuff to this player, then I'll probably make it its own variable. But for now, it's not completely necessary. We don't need to be like super optimized. Eventually, like it's going to be somewhat optimized, I guess. But I mean, for the most part, until we actually face like lagging issues, it's not really that much of a concern. Anyways, so then I'll back on our fade move script, the move player function that we just saw that we're calling. So we're now calling it with, as an input parameter, we just saw the player main of the player that interacted with the door. And then all this does is then calling this coroutine down here, wait to move, and then having the same player main thing here. It's just better to kind of call the coroutine on this object as opposed to this one, just because it's just easier to keep things kind of self-contained with that, with like coroutines like that. Yeah, so then starting this coroutine, we're first setting the player main.enable to false, so the player can't move, and then waiting our first delay, then setting fade black to true, and then setting the fact that we're fading to true, so then we fade to black, wait a little bit longer, and then we are actually doing the moving, which is just moving the player to the move to point dot position, and then moving the camera to that position as well. Technically, because the camera follows the player, we don't necessarily need to do that because the player will move and then the camera will move itself to like follow the player, but just so that it's more instantaneous and you don't see the camera actually like moving if you were to fade back in too quickly. This is just easier, especially also if the door was like really far away, then you'd have to wait a bit for the camera to catch up, and then that's just unnecessarily almost like a loading time almost, which is removed if we just actually move the camera manually. And yeah, so there's that. Also, how we actually get a reference to the transform of the player is because we already have the player main script reference, we can just use .transform to get the transform component automatically as a reference. So there's that as well. Then we wait another delay, and then we fade out of black back into being transparent so we can see again, waiting another small delay, and then giving the player control again. Yeah, some of these delays, I don't know how necessarily there will be, but I just decided to have there be some fluctuation of being able to, having options when we're doing stuff with this down the road. I don't know how often this will be used. I imagine mainly in like a hub world or something, if we have a lot of doors or something, going into houses or something, I guess. But it could be a good way to like kind of break up chunks of the level. Maybe, especially, I don't know, if we wanted to like, if a level was starting to like loop in around itself or something, and then we could have the solution of going in a door to then be somewhere else to have, I don't know. We'll figure it out. I just thought it'd be a cool thing to make, and it would be easy to make. A lot of the stuff I'm making, I'm just kind of making just to make, and then hoping that they will be useful in levels that we make. I mean, in some cases there are things that will be useful, like moving platforms, checkpoints, whatever end of level thing we have. Yeah, but then beyond that, I'm just making random things like this door, and eventually like hazards and enemies and stuff like that. Anyways, so that'll do it for this episode. The last few episodes, I keep like rambling at the end of all the things that I'm going to be making next. I don't really need to do that. If the next episode's out, you can already see by the title whatever I made next. So instead, I'll stop rambling and just say, if there's anything you want to see in this game, leave comments and all that. I want to hear your feedback of how you think this is turning out and all of that. But anyways, that'll be it for this episode. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you